So we'll hear first from Roger Kirchen, who is the director with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and they oversee, as partners, Section 106. So we'll learn all about 106. Write down your questions if you don't feel like you're comfortable asking them. We want to make sure everything's cleared up, and Roger's the expert, along with some other folks in the room.
I understand it's been a bit of a rescheduling today, and I hope you've had an interesting morning so far. I was otherwise busy this morning. I missed it, but I trust that it was interesting. Now to switch gears to something a little very important to cultural resource management, but not really as exciting as seeing pictures of what I did on my summer vacation. So I like to start any talk on Section 106, especially to a group that's maybe never heard of it or only has a loose understanding of what it is, with a little context on preservation law, just to sort of understand how we got here. So how did we get here? Considered one of the first historic preservation efforts was in the 1850s when Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, was falling rapidly into disrepair. His nephew tried to sell it to the federal government for a couple $100,000. They weren't buying it. So Anne Cunningham created the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to fight for the preservation of the house. And after establishing the group and raising money, they managed to save it for our enjoyment today. It's often considered sort of the birth of historic preservation, but also served as a blueprint for other preservation groups. Following on the heels of the Antiquities Act of 1906, which was one of the first federal efforts to protect antiquities and objects of scientific importance on public lands, in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson created the National Park Service, really with a mission to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and wildlife therein, and really preserve it for the enjoyment of others. So you see a building sort of interest in preservation and conservation. This photo is of the Lake Hotel in Yellowstone National Park, built in 1891. The park itself was established in 1872. In 1935, Congress, following the Great Depression, established the Historic Sites Act, which was really a first national policy for the preservation, and really directed the Secretary of the Interior to start developing programs that would further the preservation effort. The Historic American Building Survey was established. They went around, provided jobs for architects and engineers and surveyors to go around to the corners of the United States and record historic resources. It was not only an economic benefit, but also a preservation benefit. So, continuing on, in 1949, President Truman established the National Trust for Historic Preservation, again to facilitate the public participation in the preservation efforts of sites and buildings and objects of national and international significance. This really starts to embody the public's role in preservation, as well as solidify, I think, the federal government's commitment to preservation. But happening at roughly the same time, in 1956, President Eisenhower signed into law the National Interstate Defense Highways Act. disestablished the interstate highway system. With the rampant development in the 40s and 50s, you really start to see a great threat to communities, neighborhoods, historic properties that's really unchecked at this point. Matter of interest, this is 1969 in August. I-95 traffic, nothing new there, during the evacuation of Hurricane Camille. Along the same lines of threats to historic resources and government programs that are sort of working counter to the preservation ethic, was in this 1960s, the urban renewal program launched by the Kennedy administration. Not Richmond, not Virginia, this is St. Louis, Missouri, the Pruitt-Igoe housing development, which was built in 1954, demolished in the middle 1970s as an utter and complete failure. It's a very striking image, I think, that demonstrates that policy of urban renewal. So you have these sort of competing trends with national and public preservation efforts, with development efforts, redevelopment efforts. And in response to this conflict, a study that was coordinated by Lady Bird Johnson, President Johnson's wife, and conducted by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, really analyzed the effects of urban renewal on our communities. And the resulting report, titled "With Heritage So Rich," really revealed a growing public interest in preservation and called for a unified approach to the protection of historic resources. Now, it helps when you have the president's ear, I guess, but this report influenced Congress to such a degree that in 1966 they established the National Historic Preservation Act. So what is the National Historic Preservation Act, signed by President Johnson in '66? At a very basic level, it established the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It established state historic preservation offices like mine, established the National Register of Historic Places, and amongst other things, the Section 106 process. The motivation or the role of the federal government under the Act would be to provide leadership for preservation, contribute and give maximum encouragement to preservation, and to foster conditions under which our modern society and our prehistoric and historic resources can exist in productive harmony. A lot of operational words there. But what is Section 106? It's 126 words long. And to paraphrase, but only briefly, federal agencies shall take into account the effect of their undertakings on any historic or any district, site, building, structure, or object that is included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. The words are simple, fairly straightforward, but sometimes difficult to implement. The Section 106 process, I think, is sometimes misunderstood. It does encourage, but does not mandate preservation. Quite honestly, sometimes there's no way for a project to proceed without harming historic properties. Section 106 review does ensure that preservation values are factored into federal agency planning and decisions. Because of Section 106, federal agencies are required to assume responsibility for the consequences of their projects that they carry out. So they have a responsibility to assess what the effects of their projects will be on historic properties. But having done that, they can proceed in accordance with the regulations. So the Section 106, the 126 words of Section 106 are further expanded in the code of regulations under 36 CFR 800 that really lays out step by step the process that the federal agency must satisfy in order to comply with Section 106. And we'll go through this. But first, who are the participants in the process? Very obviously, the federal agency. And in fact, they bear the full responsibility for compliance with the requirements of Section 106. But they must make those decisions in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office or Tribal Historic Preservation Office, if it applies, and other consulting parties. But again, the decisions are theirs, the responsibilities are theirs, the liabilities are there. Other players, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the State Historic Preservation Office. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is best considered sort of our federal counterpart. They're kind of the federal Historic Preservation Office. Their mission is to promote the preservation, enhancement, and productive use of the nation's historic resources, and to advise the President and Congress on national historic preservation issues. More importantly, perhaps, they're the ones who develop the regulations on how you comply with Section 106. And they do have a required role in the process. Under the regulations, they must be afforded an opportunity to comment. This photo is of their offices in D.C. This is the old post office, built in 1899. The State Historic Preservation Office, which is in Virginia, the Department of Historic Resources, was established under the National Historic Preservation Act. And we received funding from the National Park Service to support our role in federal historic preservation programs. SHPOs, as we're commonly called, you'll hear that talked about. SHPO, that's us. We have a central role in advising and assisting the federal agencies under Section 106, but we're just another consulting party. We don't make any decisions. We generally see as our role, holding the federal agency to their requirements and their responsibilities and asking the right questions at the right time. But ultimately, our comments are recommendations that must be considered by the federal agency, but after they've considered it, alongside the comments of the consulting parties and the public, then they can proceed as they see appropriate. Section 101 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires that federal agencies consult with Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations, as well as the SHPO and other consulting parties. Tribes that attach religious and cultural significance to historic properties that may be affected by an undertaking. Federal governments maintain a government-to-government relationship with Indian tribes. These federally recognized tribes are sovereign, and so there are sort of protocols for that consultation. Currently, there are 566 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. There are currently no resident federally recognized tribes in Virginia, but there are numerous tribes that have expressed interest in consultation in Virginia and have consulted actively on projects in Virginia, and will continue to consult on projects in Virginia. Largely felt that they were removed at some point in history from their native territorial lands. Earlier this year, the Bureau of Indian Affairs announced that the Pamunkey Indian Tribe, resident in Virginia, and has received a proposed finding to grant recognition, to recognize their sovereignty. We're right now within a 6-month comment period, but it's not really expected that there would be much opposition to this, and so this is a pretty important, groundbreaking time for Native Americans in Virginia. Other tribes are pursuing congressional action for recognition of their sovereignty. Others are pursuing the BIA process. So this all could change at some point in the future. It should also be noted there are 11 state-recognized Indian tribes in Virginia. They're not afforded the same relationship as federally recognized tribes, but we do recommend that they be identified and consulted as consulting parties in the 106 process. There used to be a state agency, the Virginia Council on Indians, who coordinated a lot of that review or participation by state tribes, but it was dissolved a couple years ago. So currently, tribes are consulting individually on undertakings. This is a picture of the Virginia Indian Festival, September of 2012, with Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Pamunkey, Rappahannock, and Upper Mattaponi tribes. And rounding out the cast of characters, well, not rounding out, but also included in that are the local government. They're afforded an opportunity to participate in consultation and undertakings that are occurring in their jurisdiction, as well as any applicants for federal assistance. So if it's the locality who's applying for federal assistance, they could, or if you were a grant recipient to provide indoor plumbing for a house under Housing and Urban Development, you would be a by right consulting party in the process. And lastly, but not leastly, certain individuals and organizations with a demonstrated interest in the undertaking may participate as consulting parties due to the nature of their legal or economic relation to the undertaking or affected properties, or their concern for the undertaking's effects on historic properties. I'd like to provide a little advice on how to effectively participate in the process. I thought that might be relevant to this group. Only the federal agency can grant consulting party status, and so if you wish to participate as a consulting party, you need to contact the responsible federal agency directly. We like to be copied so that we can make sure that the federal agency is giving due consideration to these requests. It's also helpful to organize as much as possible. It's not a very effective way to have 20 individuals be consulting parties. As much as possible, we recommend that groups coalesce to some degree and unify on their perspective. That facilitates consultation, but also I think adds added weight to your position. Keep an open mind and listen to the discussion. This is a consultative process. It has no predetermined outcome. The requirements say that the federal agency must consult, and they'll do that. They don't have to listen. They have to address your comments and your concerns, but they don't have to follow your recommendations, nor do they have to follow ours. Make your interests clear. Acknowledge the interests of other individuals as legitimate, and seek to understand the interests of others. Identify shared interests. Like I said, coalesce as much as possible. And try to develop and consider a wide range of options. Bring alternatives to the table if you can come up with it. And look for an option that really allows the greatest mutual gain. I mean, the process cannot stop a federal undertaking. It cannot. Provided that the federal agency does what it has to under the law, it cannot stop their projects. We can only hope to influence them in a positive way. And of course, public consultation, different than interested parties, but the views of the public are essential to the informed federal decision-making process. The regulations direct the agency official to seek and consider the views of the public in a manner that reflects the nature and complexity of the undertaking. So if you have a very simple project which isn't likely to cause much controversy, the expectations are less than in a project that would be highly controversial, that have a great effect on historic properties. So, that's sort of what it is, who does it, how do you do it? The regulations at 36 CFR 800 lay out a fairly straightforward four-step process for agencies to satisfy their Section 106 responsibilities. I can't emphasize enough that Section 106 is a consultative process. It has no set outcome. Federal agencies are not required to preserve anything through the process. Step one. This is White's Mill in Washington County. I try to put some pretty pictures at least to kind of liven the sound. As opposed to just having all this text on there. Everybody just had lunch. I imagine the eyes get a little heavy. So first off, the federal agency has to decide whether it has an undertaking that's subject to Section 106. Okay, now when we start getting into, splitting hairs, how do you define an undertaking? Quite literally, an undertaking is defined as a project, activity, or program funded in whole or in part. So you don't have to have federal money paying for everything. Just as long as there's an ounce of federal dollars in there, you have a pound of project. Funded whole or in part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency. The federal agency doesn't have to do it, but they have indirect jurisdiction over maybe authority. Maybe they are providing funding assistance to a locality to address some housing needs. That's sort of an indirect jurisdiction. Including those carried out by or on behalf of the federal agency, those carried out with federal assistance, those requiring a federal permit, license, or approval. Not all undertakings are subject to Section 106. An undertaking is only subject to Section 106 if it's the type of activity that has the potential to cause effects on historic properties, assuming that historic properties are present. So 106 doesn't apply only if there are historic properties there. But it applies if it's a type of project that would require or that could impact historic property should they be there. So planning grants, for instance, don't really have the potential to directly impact historic properties. Now, implementation of that planning or implementation of any plan that comes out of it, well, that's a separate undertaking. You're buying computers for a school. That doesn't really have the potential to affect historic property. So it's an undertaking, but it's not subject to Section 106. And it's the federal agency's responsibility solely to define what undertakings are subject to Section 106. That's not a decision that they have to clear with anybody. They have to decide for themselves, document it, and move on accordingly. The federal agency should then, if they decide they have an undertaking subject to Section 106, initiate consultation with our office, write us a letter, say, hey, we have this going on, recognize you as a consulting party. We will continue to consult as necessary. They need to identify Indian tribes and other consulting parties at this stage and develop a plan for public participation. Once the scope of an undertaking has been determined, and that's a very simple sentence and one of the most difficult things to understand what a scope of an undertaking is. Think, for instance, if you have a Corps of Engineers permit that addresses a single wetland impact on an access road to a 500-acre industrial park. The Corps is permitting one half-acre, quarter-acre crossing of a wetland. Is that the undertaking? Or is the undertaking the 500-acre industrial park that it's servicing? You'll get different answers depending on who you ask on that question, but these are the types of things that go into defining what the undertaking is. But once the undertaking has been determined and consulting parties identified, the federal agency must begin the process of identifying historic properties that may be impacted by the project. This project, you may recognize this building. This is the federal courthouse, built in 2008 at Broad and 7th here. An undertaking built by the General Services Administration. The agency must first define an area of potential effects, or an APE. Some people call it the A, as it's commonly known. The APE is defined in the regulations as a geographic area or areas within which an undertaking may directly or indirectly cause changes in the character or use of historic properties, if such properties exist. Direct effects are fairly easy to understand. Those are the type that cause physical impacts to a historic property, tearing down a house, digging up an archaeological site. Direct effects are generally confined to the project's footprint. Indirect effects are a little bit more elusive. Those are those that commonly occur on adjacent historic properties and involve things like historic setting and feeling, those types of things. But they're not being physically impacted, but the criteria or then I'll cover this later. The criteria that make it important are being affected in some way or another. One of the first steps that a federal agency must do after identifying what its area of potential effects is to determine what we know about that area. Here's the same courthouse project at 7th Broad. And what you're seeing there is the results of information gained or gathered from DHR's database on recorded historic resources. We serve as one repository for that information, but other parties may have information on historic properties that may be affected. Local historical societies, we often recommend consultation with them and other interested parties who just have more knowledge on the ground than we do. Another step that really should occur before you start putting any shovel in the ground or mobilizing any surveyors in the field is to really understand what may be out there. This is a Sanborn insurance map from 1880s. This is the block where the courthouse was built on 7th and Broad, and you can see there was quite a bit of stuff there back in the day, including a theater, church. So this type of information not only gives you a sense of what the history of the area is, but also can inform what types of studies need to occur on the property and put into context things you may identify later on in the process through archaeological excavation and an architectural survey. This photo is not of the courthouse project, but very similar to the type of work that was going on there. This is actually an excavation at the governor's mansion. Archaeological and architectural survey and evaluation, in consultation with SHPO and other consulting parties, may be necessary to identify historic properties within an APE. We don't recommend in every case that a survey be done, but based upon factors of what has been there, what the potential for historic properties are, we may or may not recommend additional studies to be done. These studies are generally accomplished in a phased approach that first identifies really a presence-absence. Is there stuff out there or isn't there any stuff out there? And then a second phase, which goes a little bit deeper into the historical record perhaps, or a little bit more careful excavation to determine whether or not this resource is eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. And again, I'm not sure, I guess I'll cover this later, but historic properties, as defined in the regulations, are those resources that are listed or eligible for listing in the National Register. It's not everything old, but it has to meet certain criteria in order for it to be considered under the regulations. Determinations of eligibility for listing in the National Register are made by the federal agency in consultation with SHPO and other consulting parties, and are guided by those federal standards and guidelines. If there are no historic properties identified within the area of potential effects, then the federal agency may make a finding of no historic properties affected, submit that finding to us for concurrence and to consulting parties for comment, and then after 30 days can move on with this project as long as there's no objection. If there are historic properties eligible for listing in the National Register, the federal agency must then apply the criteria of adverse effect to those properties. This is the Robert Russell Moten School and Farm bill, a property that our agency holds under preservation easement, as well as had numerous federal undertakings attached to it. An adverse effect is found when an undertaking may alter directly or indirectly any characteristics of a historic property that qualify the property for inclusion in the National Register, in a manner that would diminish the integrity of the property's location, setting, feeling, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. We're starting to get into what's the feeling of a historic property? Well, that's the kind of thing that we all feel, but we can't really articulate. But does it change the experience of the visitor, for instance? Adverse effects may also include reasonably foreseeable effects caused by the undertaking that may occur later in time, or be farther removed in distance, or be cumulative in nature. You may want to consider the effect of increased accessibility to an area and development potential as part of the consideration of effects for a road, for instance. So the road might not impact anything, but the development that it may encourage could be, if properly argued, a part of the effects. Kim, is this your phone? It's ringing. If the federal agency determines that an undertaking as proposed or sufficiently revised in condition will not adversely affect historic properties within the APE, then the federal agency may make a finding of no adverse effect and submit that to the SHPO for concurrence and consulting parties and public for comment, and move forward, provided there are no dissenting opinions on that. And the regulations lay out an entire process for resolving disputes. It's not like, it's not like the federal agency can just say no and move on. If there are disputes, they're referred to the advisory council on historic preservation, and we work through that process. So I don't mean to say that the federal agency doesn't have other responsibilities if we disagree on certain aspects of the process, but ultimately, after they've gone through the process to resolve the dispute, it's still their decision to make, but there's other steps that need to be satisfied. So they just don't shrug and say, well, no, thanks, go on. It would be referred up to the advisory council, and they would write a firmly worded letter to the head of that agency making their recommendation, and then the agency will do as it sees fit. As noted, as noted in the regulations, adverse effects include physical destruction of or damage to the historic property, alteration of the property, including rehabilitation that's not consistent with federal standards, removal of the property from its historic setting, introduction of a visual, atmospheric, or audible element that diminishes its integrity, neglect of a property, which causes its deterioration, or transfer, lease, or sale of a property out of federal ownership or control without adequate protections. Should be noted that archaeological data recovery, excavation of archaeological sites is considered an adverse effect on historic properties. It hasn't always been that way in the regulations, but they've been redefined to include archaeology or data recovery as an adverse effect, simply because it's a destructive art. But it is often an appropriate treatment for archaeological sites that are going to be adversely affected. When an adverse effect is identified, the agency must consult with the SHPO and other consulting parties to develop and evaluate alternatives or modifications that could avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects. So, we need to work on trying to find a way to avoid or minimize those effects before we can move on. But if after consultation with the public and other consulting parties, adverse effects are unavoidable, and the federal agency and SHPO agree on how the adverse effects will be resolved through mitigation, they'll execute a memorandum of agreement that memorializes the steps that will be taken to mitigate or offset sort of a preservation. What good can come of this? What preservation positive thing can come out of this? If agreement can't be reached, like I said, then it would be referred up to the advisory council. And kind of bringing the presentation full circle, this, for those of you who can't readily tell, is a cell tower right in front of Mount Vernon. Adverse effect, and but it's there. So at the birthplace of preservation, we have a beautiful stealth cell tower, but it's there, and like you can, when you visit Mount Vernon, you'll have good reception if you are I think it's a singular AT&T tower. So with that, I mean that's admittedly a brief presentation on the Section 106 process. Something that after 10 years of doing this at DHR, I still am faced with questions that I don't have ready answers for. As I was telling folks earlier, the regulations are fairly straightforward as far as federal regulations go, and leave a lot open for interpretation. There is a litany of court cases which provide legal precedent for how federal agencies comply with those regulations, which really get into the nitty-gritty about how 106 is completed. And there's always something that we haven't seen before that comes across. And as you can tell, this is a view of Chaco Valley back in, I don't know when this picture was from.
Right after the war.
Right after the war?
Yeah, that's the 1865, the Lumpkins jail complex was kind of right in the center.
Oh yeah? Like
A little bit to the left.
or down?
Yep, right there.
Okay. Very good.
That's Grace.
So with that, I will open it up for questions. Be glad to try to not get too much in the weeds with it, but see what I can do.
I would just, we can get through questions quickly. If you can write them down, we'll try to take those first. So please write your questions down, and then we'll just go to people who have ready-made fast
Now we
ones.
can get started.
You sure?
Like we do raise.
Run around with people raising their hand. Write them down and
You
we'll.
want to get us?
What part of the proposed development will be subject to 106?
That's a very interesting question. We've asked multiple times. And to this point, we've not been contacted by any federal agency that says they have an undertaking here. We've asked the questions about, all the questions that you may come up with about various nexus between the project and federal agencies. We just haven't gotten a definite answer. And I think that's largely attributable to the stage of the project right now. I don't think that a lot of agencies are going to make any definitive comments until it moves beyond a conceptual stage. They're not going to comment on a concept. They comment on plans and make sure that that plan is consistent with whatever regulations they administer. So I think folks are looking at that question very carefully, but I haven't heard of any yet. There's a lot of possibilities, but haven't heard of any yet.
Okay, this is all brand new to me. 106, 106?
106.
Okay, well, what is your relationship with UNESCO? Or is there any sort of relationship with UNESCO?
There is no relationship.
Who's more powerful?
They have a global reach, so
Yes.
I would suspect that they would. There's not, as far as I understand, there are not regulations that require federal agencies to consider World Heritage sites. I mean, we make recommendations for World Heritage listing, but we're not consulted in that process. Nor do I think that there's any governing body that enforces protection of these. It's really an honorary designation as far as I understand. But it would, anything on the World Heritage Site is likely to be eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places and would be considered under the Section 106 process. I should add, as parenthetically to that, as an intermediate stage, the National Historic Landmarks Program administered by the National Park Service is sort of a stage a little one higher than the National Register of Historic Places. It's afforded a little extra consideration under the Section 106 process, and that would bring in the National Park Service if there were any undertaking that's going to impact a National Historic Landmark.
Okay, could I ask you, before you got to the section that said how you do it, how do you do it?
Yeah.
Okay, you named a number of ways to address the federal government that would be a positive way of addressing the issues.
Mm-hmm.
Could I recommend that you supply those recommendations? These folks have everybody's email address that's here today. Could you put those in the form of an email and have them send it out so that anybody that wants to talk to the feds would have some guidelines?
Absolutely.
And as well, the federal address.
Oh, well, I can provide a set of links. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has a great resource, has a citizen's guide to 106, which really addresses this issue and where a lot of these recommendations are drawn from. And it's a pamphlet that is available online that kind of walks it through in a layman's perspective, but how can the public interact with the process? So I can send those links, as well as there's on the Advisory Council's website is a link to every federal preservation officer for every federal agency. And that's the person you contact if you want attention. And the Advisory Council provides a link to that. So I'll send, and I would guess that Kim would be a good place to send that as a conduit. But I can send kind of a summary of some of this stuff and some links, and that would give you access to additional information.
Hi, so I have a question about the development, the extent of the development that might be covered by 106. What are some ways in which the project, the construction and development project might be organized that would impact whether, if part of the project was under 106 in the ballpark, what would impact whether the ancillary developments would be also subject to it? So what are some specifics of what determines that?
Well, the specifics of the federal agency would have to determine that, and it's a very good question. People talk about the ballpark project. What is the ballpark project? Is it the ballpark? Is it the ballpark and the commercial and residential development? Is it the ballpark, commercial, residential development, and the redevelopment of the boulevard? Where is it? Is it the heritage site? Everything's sort of talked about in a single breath, but where does the undertaking stop? And that's why I tried to provide a little special emphasis on how you define the undertaking. It was a very simple sentence, but that's the first and one of the hardest things to accomplish is how do you define that? It really is up to the federal agency to do so. So it has a lot to do with interconnectedness and independent utility as to how far you would define an undertaking. For instance, in the case of the access road to the industrial park, that industrial park does not occur but for the access road. It is a required element of the project. We would argue that the project as a whole is the undertaking, because the access road does not have independent utility. That's when there's a lot of legal precedent that goes into it, and then there's a real art and knack to doing that. So I don't have a definite answer to that, but these are all the questions that we'll be asking, and in fact have asked. Exactly what does the city consider to be the project at this point? And it really depends on who you ask. There are people who are working just on this piece, and there are people who work on this piece, and then there are people who have a big vision. When the federal, that's one of the first questions we would ask to a federal agency should they come to us. What's your undertaking?
That answer addressed a couple others that questions came up, but the one here that seems to be interesting is how long does the, I guess, federal Section 106 process take?
Oh, that's really dependent on the scale of a project and the complexity. All I can say is that we're afforded 30 days to comment. Every time in my presentation I said you have to come to the SHPO for comments. We have 30 days in which to provide our comments. There's not a set period of time the whole process can take. Sometimes it takes 30 days in total to get to beginning from initiation to effective termination. Sometimes it's a couple of years. I mean, if you have to conduct a bunch of studies and then negotiate or discuss effects and then negotiate a memorandum of agreement. The Section 106 process doesn't end really until there's an effective termination or if there's an agreement executed that lays out a process of how things will move forward. So it's really variable. In a project like this, it could take 18 months, 2 years, but we'll see.
Here's another pretty good one. If there is no 106 review on a project, what type of state or local laws or policies or procedures exist that kind of takes the place of the 106?
There are some state requirements, but they pertain to state projects. And some states have a state process that's akin to a Section 106 process that every project has to go through this at some level. Virginia is not one. There's no local preservation or Section 106 equivalent that would be that come into play here.
Fairfax, Alexander, and Prince William counties.
They do have there are, and I think that's going to be the topic of the next session or today, discussing what local governments could do and what local governments have done to provide those types of considerations. But Richmond is not one of those, as you'll know in his list.
I guess the question here is when it comes, I think you might have addressed this in some way, when it comes to this process of Section 106, which agencies or types of agencies may come together as part of that review or be required when it comes to that type of review? In other words, is that something that is based upon the particular project itself, or is there a particular model of how that should work?
I don't quite understand the question. There would be other administrative reviews that would have to take place, and those things are taking place. You know, DEQ, DCR, there are other review responsibilities that state agencies have, but there's no coordination. We deal with different resources. Did you ask the question?
Yeah,
Okay.
the question was maybe about, you talked earlier about there's some possibilities of federal agencies that can have a nexus to this project. Could you list those?
Oh, could I list those?
Yes.
You could have the Army Corps of Engineers if there are wetland impacts or impacts to the waters of the U.S. There could be federal highways if through VDOT if there were road improvements. There could be EPA issues with stormwater, well not stormwater, with waste water, things like that. It could be the Federal Transportation Administration through, or the rail line as it goes through there, the Federal Railroad Administration. There are a lot of federal agencies that have presence in the area, whether or not they would be involved, it's unclear. But that may not be an exhaustive list, but that's sort of an example. Those are the types of things that we've been thinking about and asking questions about, outfall, those types of things.
Follow up on that. So is it the agency's call whether they have an oar in on a project or not, or how does that?
Well, I mean, they have their regulations. I mean, if there's a permit required from the Army Corps of Engineers, then it's not they can't decide not to issue a permit. Well, they could, but it's not up to them to decide that they're not going to be involved in the project. If their involvement is required, then they would be a participant.
Does anyone else have any written questions that we'd like to address? Please forward them up. There's a question on the Lumpkin Jail project itself. Who owns the property? As far as
It's the city.
city itself. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have.
I mean, just for the record, I think DHR put some money into that
We
effort.
did both levels of effort, and that's why we did have to consult with DHR on both projects.
I'm doing on time. Time is. Couple more questions. Any more written questions? I want to get to those, for we do have some people in the audience. Okay, I think, is that one? Okay, we do have information on the website. I think, Mr. Joe, did you have a question? I think you can raise your hand for a little bit. But I want to get the written ones first because, oh, Lord have mercy. Lord, please forgive me, everybody, because I'm trying to, we go through them faster when people give them to us. All right, then, I might need your help. Help me understand this one. Ready for it? How does one get to be a federal agent on one of those acronyms there? And what requirements are there for people appointed to those positions?
Okay. Well, in my position, you have to meet the federal professional qualification standards. They're listed in federal regulation. For archaeology, it's a graduate degree. It's supervisory experience. It's a demonstrated ability to bring projects to completion. So there are requirements for people that are in a review position such as ours. A state historic preservation officer, I'm not sure if there are any requirements as far as educational background. In Virginia, our state historic preservation officer is a gubernatorial appointee, and we've just recently, within a month or so, had a new director of the Department of Historic Resources who serves as a state historic preservation officer, who is Julie Langan, and she's been appointed by Governor McCall to lead the agency. Now, and federal counterparts, ACHP has similar requirements for their staffing as we do. As far as federal preservation officers, I don't think that there are requirements. I've met folks who basically just had they were the FPO for that week because they drew the short straw. But ideally, they would meet professional qualifications.
There's several questions on adverse effects, so I'm going to throw this at you and see if it makes sense. Is an adverse effect something like a Walmart near a historic battlefield?
It could be, absolutely. If that battlefield if that portion of the battlefield has integrity as a cultural landscape, if it appears much as it did on the day of the battle or in the period of its significance, then yes. But there are a lot of portions of a lot of battlefields that don't retain that level of integrity. And you could put a Walmart in the middle of it and it wouldn't make much difference. So again, that goes to the criteria of adverse effect and the aspects of integrity of the resource that we're dealing with.
I think we might have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Just on the website.
No, not you. Were you ready, sir? Or? Okay.
You want the website for?
Where we contact them and get more information on that 106 section?
Yeah. Well, our website is DHR.Virginia, spelled out, .gov.
At GOV?
GOV, yeah.
Is it GOD or GOV?
GOV. It's a new domain name. GOV. V is in Victor.
Okay.
The Advisory Council website, and I'll send these to Dr. Allen. The Advisory Council's website is achp.gov. achp.gov. They have a lot of resources on trying to explain 106 to folks, and have a lot of resources. I go to it, frequently for guidance. So. And you can find there the regulations that sort of lay out this process. And I encourage you to read them. They're not as bad as most federal regulations. It's pretty understandable. If you sort of begin at the beginning and read through them, you can understand exactly what the federal agency's responsibility is. And I think that's most important for consulting parties, is to understand what the responsibilities of the federal agency are and see to it that they are meeting those responsibilities. So I encourage you to read the regulations. They're not so bad. So they may put you to sleep. You may take a couple times to get through them, but I encourage you to understand what the responsibilities of the federal agency are.
Do you, or is there anyone here knows whether any historic protective overlay or designation has been applied for or applied in the Chaco area at all? And lastly, would it not automatically trigger with the $13 million worth of north-south digging that has to be done to comply with EPA's mandates, as well as the east-west digging that takes place that the mayor sort of married to the ballpark along Grace Street? Would that not automatically trigger the Corps of Engineers and EPA and Department of Transportation and everybody else?
That's a great question. I will say that the ballpark development area, including the commercial development, is wholly contained within the National Register listed historic district. It's not a Oldham historic district. It's not a city overlay, but it's a National Register listed historic district. I think it's Chaco Bottom Tobacco Road Historic District. Chaco Valley.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, but it's a good question about the interceptors and the stormwater. About the federal agency's responsibilities here or their involvement in that. We will continue to ask that question. That's all I can say. We've asked it before, and we've been told that the plans are still in development. But it's not for us to decide whether or not there's a federal undertaking there. But I imagine there's going to be enough eyes on this that if there is a federal undertaking, folks like you aren't going to let the federal agency get away without doing its responsibilities. And we continue to ask that question and hold the federal agency to their responsibilities.
Great. We have one last question here.
Thank you. I had written down my two questions. I don't know what happened to them, but I was trying to get your comments on urban renewal. You'd mentioned and how it affected the destruction of many black businesses and many black communities. And the second question, you mentioned about the Pamunkey tribe being in the last phase of getting federal recognition. And I'd like to know your comments on the effects of racial discrimination on mixed bloods, basically African and Indian, and membership as being accepted as members of the 11 state recognized tribes, or most of them.
Those are both very good questions. I don't feel prepared to provide answers. I I am a bureaucrat and not a historian, an archaeologist, not necessarily a cultural anthropologist. So I respectfully will pass on trying to answer those questions. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up this session. Let's thank Mr. Kirchen. We're going to go into our panel discussion now. And so if we could have David and Pam and Terry come up front and talk about for us, with us, how we can build a community archaeology in Richmond. Some of the localities across the state have some formal mechanisms for addressing these questions so that as they come up, they can come up and be dealt with in a more systematic way. So again, prepare your questions. Make sure they get addressed. Please write them down.